It is the week of October 12th, 2015, and this is the Pioneer GrowingPoint Agronomy Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast that talks everything agronomy and only agronomy, tackling current agronomy topics, management strategies, and answering questions submitted from our listeners.
On this week's episode, we will cover considerations around fall weed control. Bruce Marty from DuPont Crop Protection will join the show via the Pioneer GrowingPoint Agronomy Hotline. And as always, we will take questions from our listeners.
And now your hosts, DuPont Pioneer field agronomists Josh Shofner and Brian Buck.
Josh, things are starting to roll pretty good out in the field. What would you say progress is so far on fall harvest?
Oh, progress is coming along well. Beans are starting to close in on probably the 90-95% mark. Corn is, we're early in corn. We're probably 20%. The weather couldn't be any better for the month of October so far. We've had a good run, and looking at the 2-week forecast, it looks pretty favorable. If this forecast can hang together, there's not going to be a lot of harvest left rolling into early November.
Yeah, looking at the moistures on corn, a lot has dropped pretty well, into the low 20s, maybe some dipping below 20, but really all you can ask for when you look at the weather we've had so far this fall. With that said, though, the weather can change, so if you have the chance to go get it, it's time to go get it.
Yeah, we are in Minnesota, and as we've talked about in some previous weeks' editions, we know there's some stock quality issues in corn. We know there's some challenges that we could run into if we get some wet and wind and other things like that. Can't stress enough to continue to keep an eye on corn stalks, continue to have a harvest plan, and with the weather the way it is, I don't think most guys are going to be backed up by the dryer. We got warm temperatures, the moistures ain't too bad overall. I think this corn crop's going to come out at a rapid pace, especially now. I'm just seeing a lot of the bean heads come off the combines, corn heads coming on. Once we get everybody rolling on corn, it's going to go pretty fast.
It's going to help a lot, too, with those moistures being lower than maybe we've seen in the past couple of years. For guys, they're not going to be hung up quite as much by dryers. They're going to be able to roll and just really go once they go.
Yeah, that's going to be nice. Guys ain't going to be waiting on their dryer to catch up to a wet bin that's full, and that's just been a real struggle for us, especially last year where things really got pushed back. We had a really bad weather late October into November, cold temperatures, and it's just hard to get corn out when it's 10 degrees and it's still 25%, where this year's looking a lot more favorable from that standpoint.
Yeah, looking at bean yields, now that we're starting to wrap up a little bit, I'd say in general guys are really happy with what they're finding for yields out there. A little bit of ups and downs like we've talked about in some previous episodes with some white mold and other diseases out there, but in general, yields have been really good on beans, and I think corn is going to come in pretty good also.
Yeah, bean yields came in probably better than I anticipated, especially with the white mold pressure we saw out there. I was expecting to see some fields that really struggle, and there were fields that were compromised by white mold, but I saw fields that had heavy pressure that still yielded mid-50s, and I didn't think they had a chance to probably crack 30. Overall, bean yields, I think growers are pretty satisfied. A lot of 70s, just looking at our GrowingPoint agronomy trials, our PKP trials and things like that. Going to be one of our best plot averages in a long time.
Yeah, going into it, I don't think guys were anticipating to take a field off covered with white mold and have a 55 average. It just tells you how good the good beans are.
The areas that were good were really good, and there were still some areas compromised, but the good areas held a pretty good average.
Switching gears, Josh, I'd like to take one of the questions that have been submitted by our listeners this week. And our question this week came from Joel near St. Peter, and that is, why are test weights not coming in as high as they thought they would this year?
Oh, that's a good question, Joel, and a question that we've had quite a bit here the last couple weeks, actually, as corn started going out. A lot of it revolves around the podcast. We talked about stock quality and premature death. I think the biggest reason we're seeing lighter test weights is a result of corn plants just shutting down before they got to black layer, much similar to we see when a crop gets frosted early. A lot of it's boiling down to we got those stalk rots, we got the fusarium, we got the gibberella, the anthracnose. Once it cuts off the vascular system, if it ain't black layered, you're going to have an issue with grain quality. The other big issue away from stalk rots is leaf disease. Move east along the Mississippi River. Northern corn leaf blight shut plants down early, and we're seeing some test weight challenges with some of those fields and farms as well.
Yeah, and a lot of those fields that maybe had that northern corn leaf blight also had a secondary stalk rot come in that really shut it down from the top and the bottom. One other thing that can affect test weight is when you have a crop that's wetter, like 32%, crops do pick up test weight as the moisture drops. So when you go from about 32 to 20, you are going to pick up some test weight, but a lot of the situations we have out there, are not that. It's just test weights in general are a touch lower from a lot of these premature death situations and some of the other things you mentioned.
Yeah, and we've seen it on the earlier maturing hybrids so far that are showing probably the lightest test weight. I do anticipate as we start rolling into the 100-day plus that we're going to pick up some test weight. I think the plant health and just those products being a little healthier down the stretch is going to improve test weight. Starting to hear of some 56s coming out of the field, out of the dryer, some 57s. I think it's something that's going to improve as harvest gets wrapped up here, and as some of those full season products get down to being combined at 20-22% or drier. I anticipate some better test weights coming down the stretch here.
The next segment on our show, we're going to bring Bruce Marty in from DuPont Crop Protection to talk fall weed control.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun conversation. Bruce is always a great guest to have on the show, and look forward to catching up with Bruce. Bruce has been spending time with crop protection over there, and couldn't be a better time to bring him in as we're getting to fall. Fall weed control is such a big topic. Something, Brian, you and I have done a lot of work with in our past experiences when we both worked over in Wisconsin, working in no-till and minimum till systems. And it sounds like Bruce is on the line. So with that, let's switch over to the Pioneer GrowingPoint Agronomy Hotline and bring in Bruce Marty.
All right, Bruce, welcome to the show. So, Bruce, you're a retail and technical sales agronomist for DuPont Crop Protection in Wisconsin. How are things looking over there, Bruce?
Really good. And I travel southwest Wisconsin, basically Eau Claire and south to the Illinois border. And things are really looking good. The crop's coming off nice. The beans are yielding well, and which is really nice to see. The corn is coming off as nice too, but there's a lot of corn that there's a lot of diseases that are out there, and so we want to make sure we get after that corn as quick as we can because we don't want any wet or wind to come in and push some corn down. So trying to get it off.
Yeah, Bruce, on last week's episode, we talked about stalk rots quite a bit, and that seems to be the biggest concern about the corn out there. Just a quick thing on beans. Any white mold? Did you fight any major disease in the beans, or things not been too bad over there?
There was pockets of it. I think that there was earlier in the season, I think we thought we'd have it worse than we did. But there's definitely areas where white mold took some yield away. But generally speaking, I don't think it was as bad as people thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I think that's the same thing we saw over here in the southeast corner of Minnesota is, heavy white mold, but it seemed like the yield effect wasn't nearly as severe as Brian and I thought it would be either. So Bruce, we're talking fall weed control today, and obviously probably not a better person to talk to in Wisconsin where there's a lot of no-till and minimum till, and something we see quite a bit of in southeast Minnesota in the hills is we fight some tough weeds like dandelions and white cockle and shepherd's purse, and some growers don't realize that fall is actually the best time to control them, and I guess we want to talk a little bit about products. I mean, in most cases where it's going to probably be anchored by 2,4-D, but DuPont Crop Protection also has some great products, and if you want to mention a few, maybe we'll talk about some of those in detail.
You bet, and I've seen that the practice of moving some of that spring pre-plant application into the fall works really well, especially in no-till or vertical till situations. And again, you nailed it. The weeds that you talked about with dandelions, white cockle, shepherd's purse, these are some of the weeds that in the spring when the guy's out ready to plant, he looks at his fields and how many get these winter annuals out of here. And the best time to do that is this fall. And you can do like a residual with a burn down with basis blend, mix that with some Panaflex, which are just really good choices. You can do that all the way up to freeze up, and it really saves time in the spring. You're going into a situation where you've got a clean field, and the guys that have started to do that in Wisconsin here are really pleased with it. We've seen more and more acres go in that direction.
Yeah, I would agree, Bruce. So you mentioned Panaflex there. Historically, I think there's a lot of guys that sprayed Express back in the day. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between Panaflex and Express?
Yeah, Panaflex is a premix with Harmony and Express. They're already premixed for you, and so that's a great burn down product. And then a lot of guys will mix that with basis blend, which is more of a residual, which is Resolve and Harmony. So you have really good residual to kill or burn down to kill the weeds that are there, the winter annuals, which is the Panaflex part of it, and then the basis blend will give you some residual. And again, the closer you get to freeze up when you're spraying that residual lasts into the spring and basically make it so you go all the way to when you plant. And you're starting again in the spring. Some of the benefits, especially if you've got no till and you've got some fields that have historically been pretty bad, and it's a great time right now to be looking at the weed control you have in your fields. Kind of choose which fields you want to hit this fall, and then those will be ready to go, ready to plant in the spring, and the weeds won't be there to keep the ground more moist. You know, they won't steal any nutrients out of the soil. So there's some real benefits to having a clean field in the spring.
Yeah, and I think, piggybacking off that, the fall, especially controlling the dandelions and those winter annuals, the biggest reason we're having more success in the fall, number one, you want to have a clean field in the spring, but one of the challenges that we've dealt with, Bruce, is even if you go out there and try to get those pre-plant in the spring, they get to be hard to kill, and a lot of that revolves around as those plants are entering dormancy in the fall, we get more water movement as those plants try to shed water. As a result, we get a lot more movement to the roots, and that's why you're going to see, in most cases, a much better kill with this fall versus spring. In some cases, my experience with the fall is you can probably have 80+% weed control, where spring you may be suffering with 40, 50, if best, in some springs, and that's a good message. I assume you're just recommending crop oil for adjuvants there, Bruce, without those products?
Yeah, crop oil, yes, that would be, and if you talk to your DuPont local rep about what we have on there, we have, like if you got fields going to corn, we'll go with Basis Blend, Anaflex, well, corn or soybeans. But if you're going to put the 2,4-D in, which I still think is a great idea, I know, Brian, you mentioned it, that a lot of times they're using 2,4-D. And again, that's an excellent choice in the fall, especially because you don't have to worry about the plant back restrictions if you're waiting and doing that in the spring. So crop oil, concentrate, mixed in with that's great. Now the other thing too is you've got perennial grasses out there this fall, like quackgrass. You can put in some abundant extra, which is the glyphosate, and some AMS to knock out the perennial grasses as long as you're there. So works really well.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a little bit of rotation. Are there any rotational restrictions? Some of our listeners may be wondering, maybe I do some unique crop rotations. Any major rotational restrictions across Wisconsin, Minnesota that we need to consider with these programs?
Not really. If you're going to corn or soybeans, that's where you're really, most of the acres are going to go to corn or soybeans. In some cases, you don't know right now which one you're going to go to. I mean, it may be a cornfield next year, it may be a soybean field next year. So if you're going to do that, using the Panaflex, and then lower your Basis Blend down to 0.825 ounces. That's the point in the front, 0.825 ounces of Basis Blend. Then you can go back to corn or soybeans, and you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, all great suggestions. So one thing, we're kind of entering the window here. The beans are coming out, which is also a good time to be doing it. In some cases, we can be spraying this on corn stalks. One thing I used to suggest to growers is maybe if you got a lot of residue there, maybe just let that settle down with the rain and let some of those plants get exposed a little bit. I used to joke that I don't think it's possible to spray this program too late. But any concern of, how long you can spray this? I guess in my opinion, if it's above freezing and there's no snow, I think you're pretty much good to spray these programs. Do you agree, Bruce?
Absolutely. We say all the way up to fall freeze up. And again, the later that you spray it, actually, the better residual or the longer residual you'll have in the spring. So some guys, that we're going to go into a wheat program this fall, they've already sprayed, or, in the process of spraying right now, going into the fall wheat. And so that basically your residual is going to take you up to the end of November typically. But for that guy that's planning on killing his weeds this fall for next spring, all the way up to, I'd delay it until, in November, when you get, it's hard to tell you what the weather is going to do exactly, but all the way up until you have fall freeze up, you can spray this stuff.
All right, Bruce. Thanks for coming on with us today. There was a lot of great insight you brought to maybe some of the different chem programs that we can bring to the table, whether you're going to corn, whether you're going to beans, and a couple different levels there and different product options you can choose from. So thanks for coming on, and thanks for the info.
It's a great opportunity. Yep, it's a great opportunity for guys to lower their their workload in the spring and get some of these weeds out of the way now. Again, especially those winter annuals. So very good. Thanks for inviting me on.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bruce.
Josh, summarizing a little bit of what Bruce said, can you kind of bring in full circle what some of the different chem options were and maybe just lay out one more time where the best fits are for each product?
Yeah, there are a couple different scenarios where the products and mixes that we talked about could vary a little bit. Let's just start with, let's just say you're a grower that's just mainly concerned with the dandelion, the white cockle, the shepherd's first pressure, and that's what you're really going to target. That's where you're going to look at likely a 2,4-D base program blended with a product like Panaflex or potentially Express that is out there. Those two products are going to do just a great job of cleaning up what's out there, get rid of those any winter annuals, and give you a very clean field to start with in the spring. Now, on the other side of things, we did talk about the basis in that mix as well, and that's really a situation where I'd use basis is, let's just say a grower maybe isn't using a full-fledged pre-emergent program, or maybe it's something where they're pressed for time and maybe some of those pre-emergents actually become kind of early post-emergence program. Adding basis into that program does a really good job delaying emergence of even some of the annual broadleaf weeds or other annual weeds that are out there, and really buys you a window to maybe get to that early post application. Those are a couple things that, maybe where you'd use one product or the other. If you're just targeting dandelions and winter annuals, I'd look at just the 2,4-D Panaflex, and that's the one thing I wanted to stress from our conversation with Bruce to clarify a little bit.
Yeah, one other thing I'd add, Josh, when I look at it, you're going to go out and make these applications in the fall. And a lot of times we went out and we'd see a field and there'd be a soybean field that looked pretty bare from the road or maybe even from the cabin we got out there. And the guy would be spraying it, kind of wondering, why am I spraying this field? There's nothing out here. But when you look at those products, there'd be misses where they'd go out and spray it and maybe there'd be a little triangle they missed up in a corner. And come spring, there'd be a bunch of dandelions, maybe some white cockle or whatever other winter annual would show up. And I think the point I'm trying to make here is these products have extremely good residual control. They do have good burn down also, but you look at the residual control they have, and that's really what we're going after when you come through winter and go into spring. So just because there's not a bunch of big green mess out there in the fall doesn't mean it's not the right option for you.
Yeah, and the best way to scout for some of these issues is really from the combine with beans. If it's something that you've been seeing in the spring, pay attention. Brian, we were out in the country a little bit today, and we saw some soybean fields that were greening up. Not sure if those are no-till or minimum-till situations, but those fields are pretty easy to identify this time of year. If it's something that you have been fighting in the spring, it will be showing up here already early this fall.
Josh, one last piece I'd like to add around these fall products also is sometimes you go out to spray them in the fall and there might not be a lot of weeds out in that field, but they still have really good residual activity. So don't feel like you're throwing your money away if you're going out there and that field is bare. They're going to have great residual activity coming back into the spring on the dandelions and the white cockles, and if you have basis in there, some of the other annuals also. So if you have any other questions around this, some different options you have are to contact your local Pioneer sales rep. They can get you in touch with the DuPont people. Otherwise, another option is you can always shoot us questions on Twitter. I'm Brian Buck at FarmerBuck1.
And I am Josh Shofner at Josh Shofner. Brian, that's a wrap for this week's podcast. This show is recorded from the Agronomy Bunker Studio in Zumbrota, Minnesota. It is produced by Brian Buck and Josh Shofner. This is a weekly podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week.